The hook Damien Cross did not raise his voice. He never had to. That was what made him dangerous. Elena Voss stood in the center of his study, a manila folder trembling in her hands, and watched her husband of 6 years sit behind his mahogany desk without flinching, without explaining, without offering a single word. She hadn't already stopped believing. The folder contained her name, her father's name, dates that stretched back to the year before she ever met Damien, evidence he had possessed, catalogued and buried, while she mourned beside an empty coffin and blamed herself for surviving. "You knew," she said, "not a question." Damien's jaw tightened. His hands, resting flat on the desk, did not move. "You knew everything. If you've ever loved someone who chose silence over your pain, someone who held the truth and called it protection, then you already understand why Elena picked up that folder and walked out the front door without looking back." Not yet. Before this story ends, one empire will fall. One secret will surface that changes everything, and two people will have to choose between the love they built and the truth they buried. This kind of story stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Drop a like and tell us in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? We want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling since early afternoon. The kind that didn't announce itself, just arrived and settled in like it owned the city. Elena Voss noticed it first against the tall windows of the Bellamy Estate's east corridor, where she had been standing for the better part of 20 minutes, holding a cup of tea she had stopped drinking an hour ago. She was not by nature a woman who snooped. That distinction mattered to her more than it probably should have, she would later admit. She had spent 6 years inside this house and had kept to her side of it with a discipline that sometimes embarrassed her in hindsight. Wing was hers, her books, her clothes, her spare notebooks from the years before Damien, when she'd thought she might become something other than the wife of a man whose calendar was classified. The West Wing was his, the study, the locked filing room, the private phone lines that never rang when she was nearby. She had respected all of it, so when she found the folder, she needed the world to understand. It was not because she had gone looking. She had been searching for the household insurance binder, the mundane, embarrassing truth of it, because the pipe under the kitchen sink had been dripping since Thursday, and the plumber wanted documentation before he'd touch anything in a house this size. She'd looked in the obvious places first: the hallway cabinet, the drawer in the butler's pantry. Then, because she remembered Damien mentioning once that he kept physical documents in the study's lower credenza, she had gone there. Credenza was unlocked. That alone should have told her something. Damien locked everything. The insurance binder was inside, right where she'd expected. She'd pulled it out, started to close the drawer, and then the corner of a second folder caught on the binder's edge and slid forward, and the tab on that folder read, in Damien's own handwriting precise, economical, the way he wrote everything a single word. Her name, Elena. She had stood there for a very long time before she opened it. The folder was not thick, maybe 30 pages. Photocopies mostly, some original documents with the texture of age in them, a few printed photographs. She recognized her father's signature on the third page, the particular leftward slant of the V in Voss that he'd never been able to correct, no matter how many times her mother had teased him about it. She recognized the name of the company her father had worked for, Halcyon Financial Consulting, which had ceased to exist 14 months after his death, dissolved quietly and without public announcement. She recognized almost everything in that folder, except for the context. Because the context was wrong. Her father, Thomas Voss, had died in what the police had ruled a gang-adjacent homicide. Wrong place, wrong time. A man walking to his car in a parking garage who happened to step into the path of violence that had nothing to do with him. That had been the official account. That had been what Elena's mother received in a phone call from a detective she met once and never heard from again. That had been the story Elena carried for 9 years, through her father's funeral, through the financial collapse that followed when Halcyon dissolved and her family's savings dissolved with it, through the years of grinding work that eventually led her, indirectly, to an introduction at a charity gala, to a conversation about nothing important, to Damien Cross. The folder said something different. It said Thomas Voss had not been in the wrong place. It said Thomas Voss had gone to that parking garage deliberately, to meet someone, and that the meeting had been arranged by parties who had reason to ensure he never left it. It contained a partial transcript, because several pages were clearly missing of what appeared to be an internal investigation. Not police. Private. The letterhead had been stripped, but the format was corporate, structured, investigative, and Damien's handwriting appeared in the margins. Not extensively. Just notes. Dates. A question mark next to one paragraph. A name circled in red ink that Elena didn't recognize. R. Calloway. And at the bottom of the last page, in that same precise hand, a date. The date was 8 months before Elena and Damien had met at the charity gala. She closed the folder. She stood in the study for another full minute, not moving, her tea cooling on the credenza beside the insurance binder she no longer cared about. The rain was audible from here, harder than before. Somewhere in the house, she could hear 2 of Damien's men talking in low voices near the kitchen, the way they always did when he wasn't home, filling the space with the mundane sounds of people just doing a job. Then she picked the folder back up and walked to find her husband. Damien was in the west drawing room, standing with his phone to his ear, his back half turned to the door. He registered her presence the way he always did, a slight shift of his shoulders, a fractional pause in whatever he was saying, and then held up one finger without looking at her. 1 minute. Elena sat down in the chair nearest the door and waited, the folder in her lap, her hands quiet on top of it. She watched him finish the call, watched him put the phone in his jacket pocket, watched him turn, and she saw the exact moment he clocked what she was holding, because something moved through his face, not panic, not guilt exactly, but something older and more controlled than either of those, something that had been rehearsed or at least anticipated. It was almost worse. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question either. A statement with the punctuation filed off. Credenza was unlocked. "I know." He didn't move toward her. "I've been meaning to put it somewhere else." "You've been meaning to." "How long?" She didn't raise her voice. She discovered, sitting there with the rain against the windows and 6 years of a life assembled in the rooms around her, that she had no desire to raise her voice at all. She felt very still, the way bodies feel just before they go into shock. "How long have you known about my father?" Damien walked to the bar cart in the corner. She watched him pour 2 fingers of something dark into a glass and not drink it, just hold it. Back was to her. "Before we met," he said. The words landed without drama. "That was the thing about the truth. Elena thought, after you'd spent years suspecting you'd been told a curated version of everything, the actual truth arrived with almost no ceremony. It just sat there. You knew what happened to him." "I knew some of it. That folder contains documentation of a private investigation. Your handwriting is in the margins. One of those notes has a date that puts you in possession of this information, before our first conversation." She heard herself speaking and marveled, abstractly, at the evenness of it. "Don't tell me you knew some of it." He turned. His face had gone careful. Not cold. Damien was never cold with her, and that had always been the thing about him that disarmed her, the thing she'd trusted without examination. He was careful with her in the way that some men are careful with things they cannot replace. She was beginning to understand that carefulness differently. "Your father found something he wasn't supposed to find," Damien said. "He was an accountant, a good one, and he was working for a company that had accounts it needed, kept clean, and he started asking questions. Halcyon. Halcyon was a front. It had been running dirty money for 3 separate operations for almost a decade. Your father didn't know that when he took the job. He figured it out about 8 months in, and instead of walking away, Damien paused. Set the glass down. He started documenting it. He was going to expose them. He was trying to protect his family. Something shifted in Damien's voice, at that a genuine quality she recognized, something not performed. He thought if he had enough proof, he could hand it over and walk away clean. He didn't understand how deep it went. "And you did," Elena said. "You understood how deep it went. By the time I found out about Thomas, it was already done. It was already gone. So you built a file." She held up the folder. "You gathered evidence of what happened to my father. You put my name on it, and you locked it in your credenza. And then 8 months later you walked up to me at a charity gala." Her voice had not changed in pitch or temperature. She felt proud of that in a remote, disconnected way. "Was I part of your strategy?" The silence that followed was 4 seconds long. She counted them. No, he said. That's not an answer that covers enough ground, Damien. I met you because Marcus introduced us. Marcus knew your background, knew the connection to Halcyon, and thought you might be an asset. Someone with reason to cooperate, or at the very least, someone with access to whatever your father might have left behind. He held her gaze through this. She gave him credit for that, though not much. I went to that gala intending to assess you, to figure out if you knew anything or had anything. And you were talking to the caterer about whether the phyllo dough was handmade, and you had a smear of lipstick on your front tooth, and you hadn't noticed. And when I pointed it out, you laughed instead of being embarrassed. He looked at the glass he'd set down. I didn't assess you. I had a conversation with you. Then I had another one. That's a very cinematic way to explain why you never told me the truth about my father. There's no good way to explain it. Try anyway. He was quiet for a moment. The rain filled the silence. At first I thought it wasn't my information to give you. By the time I understood, it was by the time I cared enough about you that it became something I should have told you. I was afraid of what it would do. To your organization. To you, she stood up. She was surprised by how steady her legs were. She crossed the room and set the folder on the bar cart beside his untouched glass, and she looked at her husband, at the man who had held her while she cried about her father more times than she could count, who had sat across from her at 100 dinners and listened to her talk about the investigation that had gone nowhere, who had said the right sympathetic things in the right quiet voice, and she felt something shift and set inside her, the way bone feels when it naps clean. I want you to understand something, she said. I'm not angry because you're involved in dangerous things. I knew what kind of man you were when I married you. I made that choice. She picked up her jacket from the chair where she'd left it. I'm leaving because you looked at my grief, the specific grief I carried for 9 years about my father, and you decided your comfort was more important than my right to know the truth. You held that secret like a kindness. It wasn't. Elena. She walked out of the drawing room. She walked through the corridor, past the east wing where her books were, past the kitchen where Damien's men had stopped talking because they could feel the atmospheric pressure of whatever was happening. She picked up her keys from the hook by the main entrance, her keys to her car, the one thing in this house that had always been entirely hers. She went to the front door. She stopped. She turned back, and Damien was standing at the far end of the corridor, just standing there watching her. And she could see in his face the particular anguish of a man who has just watched the consequence of a choice arrive and cannot argue with its justice. She said quietly, clearly, you should have told me the truth. Then she opened the door and walked into the rain. She did not look back. The drive away from the Bellamy estate took Elena 14 minutes. She knew the route by muscle memory, had driven it hundreds of times. Her hands moved automatically signals, turns, the familiar dip in the road 3 blocks east of the main gate, while her mind sat somewhere else entirely, suspended above the evening's events, like a person something happened from a height. She did not go to a hotel. Hotels left records, and whatever else was true tonight, Elena was practical enough to understand that her departure from Damien Cross's house, folder in hand, would not be the kind of event that stayed private for long. She went instead to a storage unit she rented under her maiden name, one of 2 things she'd kept entirely separate from Damien without quite knowing why. The other was a savings account, modest, seeded during the years before the marriage. She had never examined too closely why she'd maintained those 2 anchors. She was examining it now. The storage unit contained, among other things, 2 boxes she had never opened in front of Damien. Her father's things. The items her mother had given her when she'd cleaned out the apartment after Thomas Voss died. Notebooks, files, the kind of personal, professional detritus that accumulates in a man's home office over a career. Elena had taken them without looking through them. It had felt too intimate, too soon, and then the right moment had never arrived, and they had traveled with her from it to an apartment until they'd ended up here. She hauled both boxes to the center of the storage unit, sat down on a folding chair she kept there, for no reason she'd ever consciously articulated, and opened the first one. It smelled like her father. Old paper, a trace of the specific pen he'd favored, something else underneath that she couldn't name but recognized in the back of her throat. She had not expected that. She put both hands flat on top of the box and breathed through it. Then she started going through the notebooks. Thomas Voss had been methodical. That was the quality she remembered most vividly, not his warmth, which was real, or his humor, which was dry and precise, but the underlying architecture of how he organized information. Everything dated. Everything cross-referenced. He had been an accountant in the literal professional sense, and an accountant by temperament, and it showed in the way he'd kept his personal records as well as his professional ones. The early notebooks were domestic. Grocery lists, car maintenance, the kind of household logistics that accumulate in paper for people of his generation. She set those aside. The later ones she could track the progression by the dates on the covers grew denser, less domestic. More like someone who was writing things down because they were afraid of forgetting, or because they were afraid of something else. In the third notebook from the bottom of the first box, she found the first direct reference to Halcyon. In her father's careful handwriting, spoke with C. R today re the Meridian transfers. He confirmed what I suspected, the routing is not incidental. Will document and decide. C flipped through the following pages. Her father had written more than she'd expected: detailed entries, dates, specific figures, names of accounts she didn't recognize. He had understood, by the time he was writing this, exactly what he had found. She could see the develop across the pages, the way his entries shifted from precise to urgent, to something that wasn't quite frightened, but was adjacent to it. And then, near the end of that notebook, tucked between two pages so deliberately that it must have been placed there on purpose, a photograph. It was a standard printed photograph, the kind that comes from a drugstore kiosk. It showed three men at what appeared to be a restaurant table. The angle suggested it had been taken from across the room, covertly. Two of the men she didn't recognize. The third was someone she did. Older than she knew him. A younger version, the jaw was the same, the bearing but unmistakable. Marcus Vale. Damien's most trusted lieutenant, the man who had been at his side for as long as Elena had known the organization, the man who managed the inner workings of Damien's operations with the quiet competence of someone who had been doing it for decades. Marcus Vale, seated at a table with two men Elena didn't know, in a photograph her father had taken and hidden in a notebook 9 years ago. Elena held the photograph for a long time. Then she turned it over. Her father had written on the back, "Meeting at Carrera's, March 14. Vale plus Calloway plus unidentified. Financial discussion, duration 2 hairs. Do not approach, Calloway." The same name Damien had circled in red in the folder. R. Calloway. Elena set the photograph down carefully, like it might break if she moved too fast. She looked at the rest of the notebook. She looked at the boxes still to be searched. And she thought about the fact that she had been sitting in this storage unit, in the dark, in the rain, with 2 boxes of her dead father's papers, and she had found, in under an hour, a connection that Damien's private investigation, an investigation with more resources and more reach than anything her father had managed alone, had apparently not uncovered. Or had uncovered and not told her. The thought arrived slow and cold, the way important thoughts sometimes did. Marcus Vale's name was not in Damien's folder. She was almost certain. She had read it quickly under shock, but she had read enough. The folder documented what had happened to her father, documented the corporate structure of Halcyon, named several other figures, but not Marcus. Either Damien didn't know, or he did know, and Marcus's name was in the pages that were missing. Either way, Elena understood something she had not understood an hour ago. She was not simply an abandoned wife who had walked out with evidence of her husband's deception. She was something considerably more complicated and considerably more dangerous than that. He was a woman who held, between a dead man's notebook and a hidden photograph, a piece of evidence that connected Damien Cross's most trusted lieutenant to the murder of her father. She was the only person alive who currently held all the pieces together. She looked at the photograph. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the folder on the floor beside her chair, which she'd carried in without thinking. She thought about Marcus Vale's face at dinners, the way he called her Mrs., crossed with a slight formality that she'd always taken for respect. The way he had been the one, she now remembered clearly, who had first suggested to Damien that they attend the charity gala 8 years ago. Marcus knew your background, Damien had said, and thought you might be an asset. Marcus had introduced them. Marcus had engineered it. The rains outside intensified, hammering the metal roof of the storage unit with a sound like something insisting on itself. Elena pulled out her phone. she thought about calling Damien. She held the phone for a full 10 seconds. Then she put it back in her pocket. Not yet. She needed to understand what she was holding before she told anyone, including Damien, that she had it. Because if Marcus had been working against Damien for 9 years, if the leak in that organization ran that deep, then there was no way to know who else was compromised. No way to know who Damien would tell. No way to know how fast the information would travel from a phone call back to the man whose name was on the back of her father's photograph. She went back to the boxes. She found 3 more notebooks. 2 were earlier, predating Halcyon, relatively benign. But the third, buried at the bottom of the second box, wrapped in a cloth that might once have been a dish towel, was different from the others, in a way she registered before she even opened it. The cover was thicker than the standard notebooks. Stiffer. She opened it and realized why. The cover had been reinforced. Something was sewn to it. She could feel the shape beneath the fabric, rigid, flat, maybe 3 inches by 2 inches. She worked the stitching apart with her fingernails, the way she used to watch her grandmother unpick seams, patient and precise. The fabric came loose. Inside the reinforced cover was a USB drive. Small, standard. A label on it in her father's handwriting, final. Complete. Deliver if I cannot. She stared at it, then she thought about the fact that this notebook had been wrapped in cloth and buried at the bottom of a box that she had moved, unopened, 4 times since her father's death. That she had brought it into Damien's house and placed it in storage under her maiden name and never looked at it. She thought about the fact that if her father had intended to expose something and had been killed before he could, he would have needed the evidence to survive him. He would have needed to put it somewhere. No one would think to look, not with a lawyer, not in a safety deposit box, not anywhere institutional. Somewhere ordinary, somewhere personal, somewhere belonging to the person he trusted most and had the least ability to warn. Deliver if I cannot. He had left it with her, without telling her. Because he couldn't. Elena Voss sat in a storage unit in the rain with a USB drive in her hands and understood that her father had known he was in danger. That he had placed his life's most important work inside the object she was least likely to examine, a cloth-wrapped notebook in a box of his personal effects, and that she had carried it for 9 years without knowing it was there. She also understood that the moment she plugged this drive into any device connected to the outside world, the clock started. She had no laptop with her. She did not know what was on the drive. She knew what her father had believed it contained: final, complete, which meant the full evidence of everything Halcyon had been, everyone connected to it, every account and transaction and name, including, almost certainly, Marcus Vale, including possibly whatever connection ran between Vale and R. Calloway and the organizations that had kept Damien Cross in power for 15 years. She closed her hand around the drive. She sat there for a long time, listening to the rain. When she finally moved, it was not toward the exit. She went back to the boxes first and looked through the remaining materials with a focus she hadn't had before, methodical, the way her father had taught her to approach any unfamiliar problem, which was to gather everything before you conclude anything. She found 3 more relevant documents, folded into the back cover of the second notebook, a partial list of company names that meant nothing to her yet, but that she photographed with her phone anyway. A handwritten letter, addressed to no one in particular, that detailed her father's understanding of what he had found. And the last thing, the thing that made her breathe differently, a single page, bearing a list of names. 8 names. 8 individuals, titled only by role and a numerical identifier. 2 of the roles matched the organizational language Damien used not publicly, but the language she had absorbed over 6 years inside that world. The words she'd heard through doors and across tables and in fragments of phone calls she wasn't supposed to have heard. She didn't recognize all 8 names. She recognized 2 of them. One was R. Calloway. One was Marcus Vale. And beside Marcus Vale's name, in her father's handwriting, a single word: architect. Architect. Not a foot soldier. Not a contact. Architect, the word her father had chosen for the person who had designed the structure that killed him. Elena folded the list and put it in her jacket pocket. She put the USB drive in the same pocket, separate, wrapped in a scrap of cloth from the dish towel. She put the photograph of Marcus Vale back inside the notebook and secured it under her arm. She looked around the storage unit, the boxes, her father's notebooks, the accumulated materials of a careful man trying to do a careful and dangerous thing. She thought about walking back into Damien's house with all of this. She thought about what Damien would do to the man who loved her. She believed that still, even now, this raw simplicity of the evening, what he would do when he learned that his most trusted lieutenant had been the architect of her father's murder. Whether he would believe her. Whether it mattered if he believed her, because what happened next would not be a conversation. Not in Damien's world. She thought about what Marcus would do. The moment Damien showed any sign of knowing. She thought about herself, alone in a storage unit in the rain, in possession of the only complete evidence that named every person responsible and connected every thread. She thought about the word Marcus had used when he introduced her to Damien 8 years ago. At the charity gala, she could hear it now. With different ears entirely. She's an interesting woman. Worth knowing. Said with that slight smile he always wore, the smile she had always read as warmth. Worth knowing. He hadn't meant what she'd thought he meant. He had been looking for this. For whatever he believed her father had left behind. He had engineered the introduction. He had put her inside the most protected household in the city, where her movements could be observed, where her connections could be monitored, where anyone she contacted could be identified. And she had lived there for 6 years, never knowing. She turned off the light in the storage unit and stood in the dark for a moment. Her father had spent 8 months documenting something that cost him his life. He had trusted her without her knowledge, without her consent. The way parents sometimes protect children with choices those children never know were made to carry the evidence until it could be used. She had been carrying it for 9 years. She stepped out into the rain, locked the unit behind her, and stood with her face turned up to the water for just a second, 1 second, letting it be cold against her skin. Then she got back in the car and started thinking about what came next. She drove east, away from the estate, away from everything familiar. The city thinned and widened around her, the dense architecture of Damien's world giving way to older blocks, quieter streets, neighborhoods that didn't know his name. She thought about the drive in her pocket. She thought about Marcus Vale at dinners, Marcus Vale with his careful courtesy, Marcus Vale who had been the first person, after every difficult stretch in her marriage, to encourage reconciliation. He loves you, Mrs. Cross. Whatever else you think, that part is true. How much of that was management? How much of what she had believed about her own life had been shaped by a man who was measuring what she knew, and when she knew it, and whether it was time yet to act? She pulled over on a side street she didn't know the name of. Her phone showed 4 missed calls, all from Damien. No messages, he never left messages, which was a habit of his world that she had accepted without question for 6 years. She thought about calling back. She thought about what she would say. Thought about the fact that Marcus Vale had access to every communication channel in Damien's organization, and that a phone call from Elena Voss to Damien Cross, tonight of all nights, would almost certainly be noted. She put the phone face down on the passenger seat. She sat in the parked car with the rain coming down outside, and the USB drive in her pocket, and her father's photograph wrapped-eyed inside his notebook on the seat beside her. And she thought about the fact that Thomas Voss had died, trying to do the right thing with information he was not supposed to have. That he had done it carefully, methodically, in his way, the way he had done everything, and it had not been enough. She would need to be smarter. She would need to be patient in a way her grief had never allowed her to be. She would need, for the first time in 6 years, to operate entirely alone. The rain did not ease up. Outside the windshield, the city moved in its ordinary rhythm's headlights, a late bus. 2 people sharing an umbrella on a corner who didn't look at her car at all. Ordinary, unconcerned. The city did not know what she was carrying. Nobody did. Not yet. She looked at her reflection in the darkened side window. She's sitting in a car in the rain. A woman whose husband had lied to her about the worst thing that had ever happened to her. A woman whose father had trusted her with the most dangerous thing he'd ever touched. She looked, she thought, exactly like someone who had nothing, who had just lost the only life she'd constructed for herself. She looked underneath that, like someone who had just found everything. She reached down and started the car. She drove for 3 hours before she stopped moving. Not because she had a destination she didn't, not exactly, but because the body has limits that the mind in crisis tends to ignore, and hers had begun asserting them around the 2-hour mark, in the form of a tremor in her right hand on the steering wheel that had nothing to do with cold. She pulled into the parking lot of a roadside motel that advertised vacancy in flickering orange neon, the kind of place that took cash without asking questions, and she sat in the car for another 10 minutes before she got out. The woman at the front desk was somewhere past 60, wearing a cardigan with a coffee stain near the collar, and she looked at Elena the way women who've worked night shifts in roadside motels learn to look at people arriving after midnight in damp clothes with a complete absence of curiosity that was its own kind of mercy. Elena paid for 2 nights in cash. She carried nothing in but her jacket, her phone, and her father's notebook. The room was what it was. She did not look at it closely. She sat on the edge of the bed and put the notebook on her knee and took the USB drive out of her pocket and held it in her palm. Her father's handwriting, final complete. Deliver if I cannot. She didn't have a laptop. She thought about that. She thought about all the things she didn't have, a change of clothes, a plan with more than one step, anyone she could call who was not somehow inside Damien's orbit. 6 years inside that house had contracted her world in ways she was only beginning to map. The friends from before, the ones from the halcyon years, from her father's era, from the life she'd had when she was someone's daughter, and not someone's wife, most of them had drifted in the slow, natural way of people whose lives diverge. A few had tried to stay close and found the trying difficult, because Damien's world had edges that ordinary friendships tended to cut themselves on. There was one exception. Nora Hale had known Elena since they were 23, had been her closest friend through the worst years after Thomas died, and had survived the Damien transitions and by the simple mechanism of refusing to be impressed by him or intimidated by what he represented. Nora was a copy editor at a mid-sized publishing house. She lived in a third-floor walk-up, 40 minutes from the city center, and she owned a laptop she used to annotate manuscripts and watch documentaries about cold cases. She described as professional research, and Elena had always understood as her particular form of recreation. Elena stared at Nora's contact in her phone. She thought about Marcus Vale, about what it would mean to make a call that could be traced. She thought about Damien's reach, not absolute, but considerable, and about how much of that reach ran through Marcus, who had built significant portions of its infrastructure. Then she thought about her father, who had been careful and methodical and alone with his information, and who had been killed in a parking garage. Being alone wasn't safety. It was just a different kind of exposure. She called Nora. It rang 4 times. Then Elena? The voice was awake in the way that meant she'd been awake already, which was typical for Nora after midnight. It's 1 a.m. I know. I need a favor. Pause. The sound of Nora adjusting position, the particular creak of her reading chair. Are you safe? Right now, yes. That's a qualified yes. Nora. Okay. What do you need? I need to borrow your laptop tomorrow morning. Somewhere private, not your apartment. Another pause, shorter. There's a library branch on Carver Street that opens at 8. They have private study rooms. First come, first served. I can be there at 7:45. Don't tell anyone. Elena. Nora's voice went flat in the way it did when she felt she was being underestimated. Who would I tell? She hung up. She set the alarm on her phone for 6:30. She lay back on the motel bed without taking off her jacket and looked at the water stain on the ceiling, which was shaped like nothing in particular, and she thought about Damien standing in the corridor of the estate watching her leave. She thought about his face, the anguish in it, that she had given him credit for being real. She still gave him credit for that. It didn't change anything. She gave him credit for it. She slept for 4 hours. Badly. The way you sleep when your nervous system is still processing. Something it hasn't finished deciding was survivable. Nora was already at the library when Elena arrived, standing outside with 2 paper cups of coffee, and the specific expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to ask 100 questions simultaneously. She handed Elena a cup. She looked at Elena's face, at the jacket she'd clearly slept in, at the notebook under her arm. She said, "How bad? Complicated. Those are usually the same thing." Nora pulled open the library door. Study room 3 is at the back. I already checked. The room was small, a table, 4 chairs, a frosted glass window that let in gray morning light. Elena sat down, and Nora set the laptop on the table between them, and then sat back in her chair and folded her hands in her lap and waited, which was one of the qualities Elena had always valued in her, the understanding that sometimes the information needed to arrive in its own order. Elena told her. Not all of it, not the operational details of Damien's world, which Nora neither needed nor would thank her for, but the structure of it. Her father, Halcyon, the folder in the credenza, the notebooks, the photograph, the name on the back. Nora listened without interrupting, which was harder than it looked, given her expression, which cycled through several things that weren't quite surprise. Because Nora had always had, in the back of her assessments of Damien Cross, a watchfulness she'd mostly kept to herself. When Elena finished, Nora said, "Mark's Vale. Yes. He's been in your house, twice a week minimum for 6 years." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed the laptop forward. "Use it." Elena plugged in the drive. It loaded slowly old format, the kind of drive that had been sitting dormant for years, its contents compressed and layered in ways that suggested deliberate organization. When it finally opened, it was not a collection of loose documents. It was structured, the way her father structured everything, folders labeled by date, by subject, by name. She navigated through the top level, and the scope of it settled over her like something physical. Her father had not simply documented what he'd found. He had built a case. Halcyon Financial Consulting's full transaction history for 9 years, extracted from the internal system and annotated. Count routing that traced money through a chain of shell companies in 3 different countries. Contracts signed bearing the names of individuals who had publicly legitimate lives, a city council member, 2 private equity partners, a senior figure in the regional port authority whose name Elena recognized from newspaper profiles about civic investment. And deeper in the file structure, a subfolder labeled only V that she opened with a steadiness she had to work for. Marcus Vale. Her father had documented him comprehensively. Not with drama. Thomas Voss had not been a dramatic man, but with the accumulated weight of evidence gathered by someone who understood that detail was the only argument that could not be dismissed. Meeting records, financial transfers that connected Vale to accounts within the Halcyon network. A recorded phone call, audio file, date stamped, that she did not play with the laptop's speaker, but plugged Nora's earphones in to listen to privately. She listened for 90 seconds. Then she took the earphones out and set them on the table. "It's him," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that in the same remote way she'd been proud of it the night before. Talking to someone called Calloway, discussing what to do about, they used the phrase "the accountant." "That's my father." They're discussing what to do about him. Nora had gone very still. "This drive has been sitting in a motel storage unit, in your storage unit for 9 years, Nora said. Her voice was precise in the way it got when she was editing, when she was finding the exact shape of a problem. "You've been carrying this for 9 years. I didn't know it was there." But Vale did, or he suspected. Elena looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You said he engineered the introduction to Damien. He put you inside that house. If he believed your father might have left evidence, and if he was smart enough to design what your father says, he'd have wanted you somewhere he could watch you. Somewhere your storage units, your mail, your connections could be monitored without you knowing." Nora paused. "Has anything in that storage unit changed since you've been with Damien? Any indication someone else had been in there?" Elena thought about it. She thought about the lock, which she'd replaced 2 years into the marriage, after losing a key Damien's security consultant had suggested it, citing a general upgrade of her personal security protocols, which she had accepted as reasonable at the time. Damien's security consultant. Who reported to whom? She thought about that. "Someone has been in there," she said. Not a question. "They looked and didn't find it because my father put it somewhere they wouldn't have thought to look. Cover of a notebook, which means they've been looking for 9 years and haven't found it." Nora met her eyes. "And now you have it, and you've been gone since last night. Which means how long before someone figures out where you went?" "I paid cash at the motel. You called me on your phone." Elena had thought of that. She'd thought of it at 1 in the morning, and she'd called anyway, because the alternative was her father's lesson applied to its worst conclusion. "I know. You need to move. And before you move, you need to make a copy of everything on that drive somewhere that isn't a single physical object someone can take from you." They spent the next 40 minutes working. Nora, who edited manuscripts for a living and understood document architecture better than most, organized the copy systematically cloud storage under a new account created on the library's guest Wi-Fi. email to 2 addresses they created for the purpose, a second physical copy on a new drive they bought from the library's small technology vending station near the entrance. Elena did not relax while they worked. She kept her eyes on the frosted glass window of the study room, on the door, on the corridor visible through the glass when someone passed. Nobody came. When they were done, Elena took the original drive and put it back in her pocket. She kept the copy. Nora held the second copy without being asked, because she understood without being told that distributing it was the point. "You need to go somewhere," Nora said. "Somewhere offline for a while." "I have some money." "That's not what I meant. I meant you need to decide what you're going to do with this." Nora tapped the copy drive on the table. "Because this isn't just about your father anymore. This is about organizations that are still operating. People who are still protected. You're the only person who has the complete picture." "I know. Including Vale. Including whoever Calloway is. Including whatever connects all of this to Damien's organization." Elena said nothing. Nora looked at her carefully. "What are you going to do about Damien?" "I don't know yet. That's not nothing. You've had all night to decide you hate him, and you don't know yet means something. It means I'm not making decisions about him until I understand what I'm holding." She put the copy drive in her jacket pocket. "It means the order matters. Evidence first. Everything else after." Nora nodded. She started to pack up the laptop. Then she stopped. "You know he's already looking for you." "Yes. And Vale will know you're looking." The moment Damien started making calls last night, Vale knew something had shifted. He's had 9 years to plan for the moment you found something. The word sat between them with their full weight. Elena thought about Marcus Vale, in Damien's house right now, or making calls of his own, or sitting in that careful stillness he always projected while his mind ran calculations that nobody around him could see. She thought about what it felt like to have been in the same rooms with him, to have accepted water glasses from his hand, to have smiled at his slight formal courtesy. She thought about the word her father had written beside his name. Architect. Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number. Which meant it was one of Damien's secondary lines. He rotated them. Security habit. And he had decided that she wasn't picking up the primary calls and had moved to the secondaries. She let it buzz. It stopped. Then it buzzed again immediately. Picked it up. "I'm not coming back tonight," Damien's voice. Low. The particular compression in it that meant he was somewhere he could not speak freely. "Elena, listen to me. I'm listening. Where are you?" "Somewhere you don't need to know right now." A pause. She could hear him breathing the controlled exhale of someone managing something. "Marcus came to me this morning. He said you were seen leaving last night, that you had a folder. He wants to know what was in it." Cold came back, precise and total. "He came to you himself," she said. "He's concerned," he said. "Elena, he said your safety might be at risk. That whoever gave you that folder might have an agenda." She looked at Nora, who couldn't hear Damien's side, but could read Elena's face well enough to have gone absolutely still. "The folder came from your credenza," she said carefully. "You know that." "I know." The word had weight. "But Marcus doesn't know what's in it. He's asking questions I don't know how to answer without telling him things I'm not. Elena, I need to know where you are. I need to know you're safe." "I'm safe. Are you alone?" She thought about Nora across the table. "Yes. I'm going to send someone to." "No." The word came out flat and final. "You're not going to send anyone to anywhere, because I haven't told you where I am, and I'm not going to. And if Marcus is asking questions about the folder, then you already have a problem that has nothing to do with me." Silence. "What do you know?" Damien said, and his voice had changed. The careful management was still there, but something under it had shifted the tone a man uses when he's stopped pretending he knows the shape of a situation and started actually trying to understand it. "More than you," she said, "and right now, that's the safest way for it to stay. If Marcus asks you again, tell him the folder was personal financial documents. Tell him nothing else." She kept her voice even. "Don't tell him anything. Not because I'm asking you to protect me. Because I'm telling you that until you know what I know, you cannot trust his response to any information you give him." A long pause. The kind that meant he was running the implications and arriving somewhere he didn't like. "How long have you known?" he said. "It was not about the folder." "Since last night." "And the folder, what does it connect to?" Damien. She said his name the way she'd said it 1,000 times in the domestic ordinary of their shared life, and felt the gap between that and this like a step onto a stair that wasn't there. Don't ask me that on an open line. He understood. She could tell from the silence. Are you going to come home? He said finally. No, not yet. Then I need you to check in every 12 hours. I need to know you're alive. I'll check in. She ended the call. She and Nora looked at each other across the table of the study room, in the gray morning light, with the copy drive between them and the sound of the library opening around them, ordinary voices. A cart rolling. Someone asking about a hold on a book, the sound of the world continuing on its regular axis, while Elena's had tilted somewhere past correction. Vale moved fast, Nora said. He was already watching. He just needed the starting signal. She stood up. I have to go. I need to find out who Calloway is. A full identity, not just a name. And I need to find out what Vale's connection to the rival families looks like from the outside, because if he's been managing both sides of the organization for years, there are financial trails. I can help with public records, company registrations, land records, anything in open sources. I'll send you the names from my father's list. Don't search them from your home network. She paused. Nora, if anyone contacts you, nobody's going to contact me. If they do. Nora's voice was even, the voice she used for editing conversations when someone was resisting a correction that needed to be made. I've been waiting 8 years for you to let me actually help you with something. I'm not going to fall apart now. Elena looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and picked up the notebook and walked out. She spent the day moving. Not running, she had learned something, in the past 12 hours, about the difference between panic and action, and she chose action with the deliberateness of someone who understood that speed without direction was just faster exposure. She changed the motel, paid cash again, used a name from a character in one of her father's notebooks, a small, private acknowledgement to a man who had always loved detective stories and had probably not imagined his daughter would need the lesson. She sat in the new room with the original drive and the copy and her father's notebook and the photograph and the list of 8 names, and she built it out. The way her father would have, not rushing to conclusions, letting the connections emerge from what was actually there, rather than from what she was afraid to find. R. Calloway resolved first, the voice on the recording. The name circled in red in Damien's notes. She had the partial company registrations from her father's files, and Nora working fast, from a cafe, on a phone plan that wasn't her primary, found the rest in 3 hours. Renard Calloway, who existed publicly as a logistics consultant with offices in 2 cities, and a record of civic involvement that stopped just short of political, but maintained the profitable adjacency. What Nora found in the company registration trails was a pattern, the same pattern her father had found in Halcyon's accounts, replicated across 6 different entities over 15 years, all of them structured to move money between the crime families that operated in the region and the legitimate financial structure that made the movement invisible. Calloway was not just connected to the families, he was the connective tissue. And Marcus Vale was his primary interface with Damien's side of the operation. She sat with that for a long time, because it meant something specific. It meant the conflict she'd been watching in fragments, the rival crews moving against Damien, the sense of pressure that had been building in Damien's organization for the past several months. The whispered conversations she'd caught edges of, through closed doors, was not random. It was managed. Someone was managing the pressure on Damien, timing it, using it, manufacturing the conditions under which Damien's empire would be maximally vulnerable. And that someone was inside the house. She called Damien on the second 12-hour check-in. His voice, when he answered, was different from the morning tighter, the way it got, when something had happened that he hadn't been able to control. What's changed, she said, instead of hello, a short exhale. 2 of our distribution points were hit this afternoon. Coordinated. Someone with operational knowledge of the routes. Closed her eyes. That's internal information, she said. Yes, Damien. She pressed her hand against the notebook cover, felt the slight ridge where the stitching had been, where the drive had been hidden. Who knew those routes besides your inner circle? Silence. He was getting there himself. She could tell, could hear it in the quality of the silence. The particular way Damien thought through implications he didn't want to reach. She had spent 6 years learning to read his silences. The routes were reconfigured 2 weeks ago, he said finally. Marcus handled the reconfiguration, and the attack happened today. Elena, listen to me very carefully. She kept her voice level. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a clinical way, the way you become aware of a machine while it's running, because you're paying attention to what it's doing. I have evidence. Physical, documented, recorded evidence that connects Marcus Vale to the people who killed my father, to the network that has been operating against your interests inside your own organization, and to the current pressure campaign that is dismantling your operation piece by piece. I have had this evidence for 24 hours. It's secure, copied and distributed so that no single action can eliminate it. The silence that followed was the longest ones she'd ever waited through with him. How long, Damien said. The evidence has existed for 9 years. My father built it. Marcus has been looking for it since before you and I met, which is why Marcus arranged for us to meet. He believed I might have it without knowing it, and he wanted me somewhere he could watch me. She heard the sound he made. It was not loud. It was contained in the way Damien contained everything. But underneath the containment, it was the sound of a man who had just understood the architecture of a betrayal that had been operating for nearly a decade inside everything he'd built and trusted. He arranged it. Yes, all of it. I don't know how much, but enough. Another silence. Then are you safe where you are for now? I'm going to. He stopped again. Started differently. I need to see you. Not yet. Elena, I'm not saying no. I'm saying not yet, because the moment we're in the same room, Marcus will know, and Marcus will move, and I will not walk into that situation without a plan that protects the evidence first. Her voice was steady. She felt the steadiness as something she was maintaining, rather than something she naturally had, which was honest. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Yes. The word was flat and certain, and loaded with something she couldn't fully name. I understand. Can you keep him unaware for 24 more hours? Not confronting him. Not changing your behavior. Functioning as though nothing has changed. Damien was quiet for a moment. She could imagine him the specific stillness he had when he was building a decision from the inside out, the way his expression went neutral, not blank, but clean. I can keep him unaware, then I need 24 hours. She was about to say something. She had a next sentence, a next step, when her phone buzzed against her palm with a notification from the second email account she'd set up at the library. The account that was supposed to be private, that only she and Nora knew existed. She looked at it. The email was from an address she didn't recognize. No subject line. The body contained 5 words and a photograph. We know you have it. The photograph was of her, taken from a distance, grainy with digital zoom but identifiable. She was standing outside the storage unit the night before, face turned up to the rain, the notebook already under her arm. They had been there, last night in the dark and the rain, watching her. Not close enough to act, or choosing not to act, which was different and more deliberate, but close enough to document. Close enough to send a message. I have to go, she told Damien. Elena, 24 hours, she said, and ended the call. She stood in the motel room with the phone in her hand and looked at the photograph of herself in the rain. Looked at the timestamp on the email, looked at the email address, a string of random characters that would trace back to nothing. She already knew that without checking. They had been watching her leave the estate. They had followed her to the storage unit. They had documented her, finding the drive and walking out with it. And they had waited not 12 hours, not 6, but the entire following day before sending this message. That wait was information. People who acted immediately were reacting. People who waited were choosing their timing, which meant they had a plan and the patience to execute it, which meant this was not improvised. She thought about Marcus Vale, sitting in Damien's house right now, with his slight formal courtesy, managing the questions Damien was asking about the folder, timing the distribution point attacks, receiving reports from whoever had been watching Elena in the rain. She thought about the 24 hours she had just asked Damien for. She thought about how, in the time it took her to make 2 phone calls, the situation had changed from she held the evidence, and they were looking to they knew she had it, and they were waiting. 24 hours might be generous. She grabbed the notebook and the drives and her jacket, and she was out the door in 90 seconds, moving down the exterior corridor of the motel toward the parking lot, the cold night air hitting her like a correction. her mind already running the next step and the one after that while her body moved on instinct, the way it had been trained to by 6 years of living inside the specific awareness that Damien's world required the habit of watching, of reading exits, of understanding that the moment you stopped moving was the moment you became a target. She did not slow down. She did not look back. But she heard, from somewhere behind her in the parking lot, a car that had been idling, that was no longer idling, the sound of an engine that had just been put in gear. She did not run. Running was what people did when they panicked, and panic was what got you caught. She had learned that not from Damien directly, but from 6 years of absorbing the logic of his world, by proximity, the way his people moved when a situation turned, the controlled urgency that looked, from the outside, almost like calm. She walked to her car, fast but walked. Keys already in her hand, the way she'd been taught by a self-defense instructor Damien had hired in the 2nd year of their marriage, the one practical gift that world had given her that she'd never thought she'd use for this. The engine behind her was moving. She could hear it tracking her angle across the parking lot without accelerating the deliberate pace of something that did not need to rush because it believed it had already won. She got in the car, started it, pulled out of the space in a single motion, and went left, away from the motel exit, toward the service road that ran behind the building. She had noted it when she checked in habit, the same habit that made her always sit facing the door in restaurants, that made her know where the secondary exits were in any building she spent more than 20 minutes in. 6 years the car behind her followed. It was a dark sedan, American, nothing distinctive. 2 occupants from what she could see in the rear view. They were not trying to hide anymore. The idling had been the last pretense of surveillance. This was pursuit. She drove the service road to its end, where it met a larger arterial that she didn't know by name, but recognized by its direction east, away from the city center, toward the industrial quarter, where the streetlights thinned and the buildings went dark early. Turned east. Her phone was on the seat beside her. She picked it up and called Damien without looking at it, muscle memory dialing while her eyes stayed on the road and the mirrors. He picked up before the second ring. Where someone is following me. Dark, sedan, 2 people. They've been on me since I left the motel. She kept her voice flat, descriptive, the way he always gave information when things moved fast. I'm heading east on. I don't know the street name. It's the arterial past the service road, behind the Riverside Motel on Cutler. I know it. A pause, not hesitation calculation. 3 blocks east, there's a light industrial complex, Fenwick Storage. The gate code is 8441. Drive through and go to the 3rd building. Leave the car inside. You know this road. I know most roads. The flatness in his voice had shifted to something else operational focused, the version of Damien she had heard through closed doors, but rarely been spoken to directly. How close are they? She checked the mirror. 4 car lengths. They're not closing. They want to see where I go. Then don't go to Fenwick. She understood immediately. They want the drive. If they were going to take you, they'd have done it at the motel. His voice was certain in the way it was when he'd already run the scenario. They're following, because they don't know where the copies are. They need you to lead them somewhere. She thought about the email. We know you have it, not we have it, not give it to us. They knew she had it, and they were waiting for her to make a mistake. Nora, she said. Who? Someone who has a copy. If they've been watching me since the storage unit, they may have followed me to the library this morning. Her hands tightened on the wheel. I have to warn her. I'll handle it. Give me the name and address. Damien Elena. His voice went to the place it went when there was no room for alternatives. You cannot make that call while you're being followed. Give me the name. She gave him Nora's name. She gave him the address. She felt the specific quality of trusting him with something after the past 36 hours, felt it like a seam under pressure not broken, but tested in ways she could not fully assess in real time. 3 blocks ahead, Damien said. There's a bus depot on your left. Pull in. The buses run through midnight and the lot stays open. Walk into the terminal building and stay with people. And the car behind me? My people are 3 minutes out. She did not ask how. She had never asked how. That had been one of the structural conditions of their marriage, the area she had accepted without examination, and she was aware of the irony of relying on it now. Irony was a luxury, and she was busy. She pulled into the bus depot. The sedans slowed but did not follow into the lot it continued past, which told her something. They were disciplined. They had patience and they had instructions, which meant they were professionals who were not operating on their own initiative. She walked into the terminal building and stood near the central concourse where 3 different bus routes intersected, surrounded by late travelers and shift workers, and the particular exhausted population of people who relied on public transit after 10 at night. She kept her back to a pillar and watched the entrance. 11 minutes later, a man she recognized from Damien's security detail came through the door. He made no signal. He simply positioned himself between her and the entrance and did not look at her, which was its own kind of communication. Her phone buzzed. Damien, Nora Hale is being moved to a location my people secured. She's safe. She had the drive on her. Elena exhaled. It was the first full exhale she'd managed in hours. Thank you, she said. Don't, his voice was not unkind. Just get to me, please. The drive to Damien's secondary location, not the estate, something smaller. A property she'd known existed but never visited. An apartment in a residential building on the north side that Damien maintained under a holding company for operational situations that required distance from the main house, took 40 minutes in a car that was not hers, driven by the security man from the terminal who spoke exactly twice during the journey, once to confirm the route and once to tell her they had not picked up a tail. She spent the 40 minutes thinking about Nora in a secured location, about the photograph of herself standing in the rain, about Marcus Vale asking Damien questions about the folder, while a team followed Elena across 2 motels and a bus depot. She spent some of it thinking about the audio file on the drive. Her father's voice was not on it. The call was between Marcus and Calloway, but her father had been the one to make the recording. He had been close enough, careful enough, patient enough to capture the moment when 2 men discussed what to do with him. She had listened to 90 seconds of it. She had not listened to the rest. She had not been ready for the rest. She thought she might be ready now. The apartment was on the 7th floor of an ordinary building, indistinguishable from the 15 similar buildings on the block. Insides, it was sparse in the way that functional spaces are sparse furniture that served purposes rather than aesthetics. Clean, maintained. Damien was already there when she arrived, standing at the window with his jacket off and his sleeves pushed up, which was the most physically unguarded she had seen him in years. Turned when she walked in. He looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept and had spent several hours confronting the architecture of something he had built and not examined closely enough. She understood the feeling. They looked at each other from across the room. Neither of them moved immediately, which was its own kind of conversation, all the things that needed to be said stacking behind the immediate pragmatics that had to come first. Nora's all right? Elena said. She's fine. She was not happy about being collected, but she's fine. She wouldn't be. Elena set the notebook on the small table near the door. She set the drive beside it. I need a laptop. He produced one. She sat at the table, and he pulled up a chair across from her, not beside her. Across, which was honest, and she opened the drive and navigated to the audio file. This is from my father's documentation, she said. It's a recorded conversation between Marcus and Calloway. I've heard the first 90 seconds. I need you to listen to all of it with me. His jaw tightened slightly. He nodded. She pressed play. Marcus Vale's voice came out of the laptop's speaker with the terrible clarity of a good recording. Unhurried, precise, with a slight formal courtesy that Elena had spent 6 years mistaking for professionalism. The conversation ran for 11 minutes and 23 seconds. Elena listened to it in its entirety for the first time. She watched Damien's face while she listened to his lieutenant's voice discuss the disposal of a problem named only as the accountant, confirm that the halcyon accounts had been flagged and would need to be restructured, and detail in the specific language of a man who had done operational planning many times, before exactly how Thomas Voss would be handled, and why the handling needed to be clean and untraceable. Halfway through, Damien's hands, which had been resting on the table, moved. He pressed them flat, very deliberately, and she could see the effort of that deliberately in the tendons of his wrists. He did not speak. The recording reached its end. The silence after it was the kind that has weight. I didn't know, Damien said. His voice was different from any version she had heard, before stripped of management, of performance, of the careful architecture he normally placed between himself and vulnerability. I want you to understand that I am not saying that as a defense. I'm saying it because it's true and because you deserve to hear me say it plainly. I know you didn't order it. She had known that, she realized, since the night before. Since reading her father's files, which named everyone except Damien. His notes in the folder had been those of someone investigating, not someone covering. But Marcus built the structure that killed my father using resources from your organization. Your money, your infrastructure, your name as protection. Yes, for 9 years. Yes, his voice did not excuse it. She gave him credit for that. The rival crews moving against you. The distribution point attacks today. She turned the laptop toward him, showing him the financial trail Nora had helped her map that morning. This has been coordinated for months. Calloway is managing the external pressure. Marcus is managing the internal response, making sure your defenses move wrong, making sure the vulnerabilities stay open. They're not trying to defeat you in a confrontation, Damien. They're dismantling the organization from inside while making it look like external attack. Studied the screen. She watched him absorb it with the particular focus of someone who had spent decades building the thing now being shown to be eaten from within. Jaw worked. He did not look away from the screen. How far does it go, he said. Not a question about the files. Question about his own organization. I don't know. My father's documentation names 8 people total, 2 of whom I identified. The others are listed by role and number. Some of those roles sound like they're inside your structure. Quiet for a moment. I need to see the full list. She hesitated. He caught it. Elena. I'm thinking about the order of operations. She kept her voice even. If I show you the full list and you move on any of them without a complete strategy, Marcus will know immediately that you know. He's been watching the inside of your organization for 9 years. He will have signals in place, people who report to him, behaviors that trigger a response. The moment your behavior changes toward anyone on that list, the clock starts. I understand that. Do you understand that the clock, once started, ends with them coming for the evidence directly? Not following me, not waiting to see where I go. Coming for it, she held his gaze. They sent me a message tonight. A photograph taken in the rain. They've had at least 12 hours to plan whatever comes, after patience stops working. Damien looked at her for a long moment. She could see the conflict in him, the operational instinct that wanted to move, to act, to do the thing that men built like him always defaulted to when threatened, fighting against an intelligence that understood she was right about the order. Tell me what you need, he said finally. She told him. They worked through the night, not together. Exactly the distance between them was still there, would be there for some time, maybe always in some form. She was honest enough with herself to hold that possibility, but in the specific productive parallel of 2 people who understand the same problem and are moving toward the same solution from different angles. She mapped the evidence. He mapped the organizational structure, identifying which of his people had exposure to the specific operational areas that matched the 8 roles in her father's list. By 3 in the morning, they had 4 names. 4 people inside Damien's organization who matched the roles, who had the access, who had been in the right positions at the right times, to have fed information to Marcus and through Marcus to Calloway for the past several years. Elena looked at the 4 names on the paper between them. There's something else, she said. He looked up. She had been circling it all night, the things she had not said yet, things she had listened to in the audio file and not addressed because the rest of the material had been so dense. And because she was honest with herself about this, she had needed time to absorb it herself before she said it out loud. On the recording, she said, 11 minutes in, when Marcus and Calloway discussed the restructuring of Halcyon accounts after my father's death, she kept her eyes on the paper between them rather than on his face. Calloway mentions a second phase. He calls it the consolidation. He says the accountant was only the first problem, and that the second problem was still inside the primary structure. Second problem. He doesn't name it. But Marcus says, she made herself say it cleanly. Marcus says, the primary structure won't be a problem. I've managed his exposure for the past 3 years, and he doesn't see it yet. And Calloway says, make sure it stays that way. Silence. That conversation was 9 years ago, Damien said. Yes, Marcus told Calloway he'd managed my exposure for 3 years before that. Which means 12 years, Elena said, at minimum. Damien sat back in his chair. The movement was small, but she felt the weight of it, the specific gravity of a man, absorbing the fact that the framework he had operated inside for his entire professional life had been shaped, in ways he could not yet fully calculate, by someone who was not working in his interest. Everything I built, he said. Not loud, almost quiet. Not everything. He needed your organization to function in order to use it. Couldn't compromise the whole structure he needed, the infrastructure, the protection, the network. Kept most of it real. He just redirected certain flows. Shaped certain decisions. She paused. You've been building the same thing he needed. He just made sure it stayed useful to him, while you thought it was entirely yours. Damien was silent for a long time. She watched his face and saw something move through it that she had never seen before, in 6 years, not anger. Not the controlled heat she'd seen when his organization was threatened, not the cold focus of operational crisis. Something older than all of that. Something that looked like a man encountering the full scale of his own blindness for the first time and finding it almost impossible to stand inside. She did not offer comfort. She did not think he wanted it, and she was not sure she had it to give. What do you need from me? He said finally. The same words as before, but different now, heavier, the weight of someone who has relinquished something. I need access to 3 specific account records. Your internal financial system, the accounts that manage the restructured Halcyon flows, I think they're still running through your infrastructure under different labeling. My father's documentation shows the original structure. If I can see what they became, I can map the current network, and that gives us Calloway. I can get you access without Marcus knowing. There's one person in the financial team who doesn't have exposure to Marcus. He thought for a moment. She'll want to understand why. Tell her as little as possible. Tell her it's an internal audit. He nodded. It'll take until morning. Then we wait until morning. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the north side of the city at 3 in the morning. At the ordinary lights of ordinary buildings, where ordinary lives were conducting their ordinary midnight business. She had not eaten since the library. She was aware of it the way you're aware of minor physical facts. During a crisis noted, filed, unaddressed. Behind her, she heard Damien stand. She heard him move to the kitchen, the sounds of someone assembling the basics. A few minutes later, he set a plate on the table beside her without saying anything. Bread, some cheese, the kind of minimal practical care that required no sentiment and no conversation. She sat back down and ate. He sat across from her and watched the table. After a while, he said, "The night you left at the gate." He wasn't looking at her. "You said I should have told you the truth." "Yes. I've been thinking about when I could have. I've been going through the years and trying to find the moment." He was quiet. "I can't find one where I thought I was making the wrong choice. That's the part I can't." He stopped. Started differently. "I always thought I was protecting you. Every time I chose silence, I told myself it was to protect you. I know, that's not good enough." "No," she said. "It isn't." They sat with that between them, which was where it needed to be. At 4:30 in the morning, Elena's phone, the second phone, the one she'd bought at a pharmacy 2 days ago, received a text from the unknown number that had sent the photograph. She looked at it. Then she turned the phone and held it so Damien could see the screen. The text read, "We don't want the drive. We want a meeting. Vale has agreed to terms. Come alone or the woman dies." Below it was a photograph of Nora Hale, sitting in a chair, hands bound in front of her, eyes open, expression furious rather than frightened, which was so precisely Nora that Elena felt it in her sternum in a room she did not recognize. She looked at the photograph for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Damien. "I thought your people had her," she said. Her voice was very quiet. Damien was already on his phone. She watched his face go through several things rapidly, the contained explosion of a man whose certainty has just been removed from under him. He spoke to someone in short, low sentences. He listened. Put the phone down. "They had her for 40 minutes, he said. "Someone hit the location. 2 of my people are in a hospital." Nora Hale was taken. Elena felt the room's dimensions change around her. Not metaphorically, literally, the physical sense of space contracting, the way it does when a threat that was abstract becomes immediate and personal in a way that the body registers before the mind finishes processing. Nora had been taken because Elena had given Damien her name and address, had given them to him on an open line, or had given them to a man who she looked at the text again. Vale has agreed to terms. Not Vale is arranging this. Vale has agreed to terms, as though Vale was not the instigator, but a participant in an arrangement that had already been structured before tonight, which meant the hierarchy was not Marcus at the top, with Calloway below. It was Calloway's architecture with Marcus inside it. And above Calloway, who does Calloway report to, she said. Damien looked at her. Calloway is a coordinator. He's infrastructure. He doesn't build something like this for his own benefit. He runs it for someone else. 12 years, multiple crime families, level of reach that includes your inner circle and your security infrastructure, and apparently the location of a safe house you believed was secure. She set the phone down on the table. Her hands were steady. She focused on that. Someone above him has been running this for a very long time, and they've just decided that waiting is over. Damien's face had gone to a place she had not seen before. Not the operational focus, not the grief of earlier. Something beneath both of those, the bedrock of a man who has reached the point where everything he was managing, he can no longer manage. If I go to that meeting, Elena said, they get me and the drive in one location and they end it. You're not going to that meeting. If I don't go, they have Nora. She's there because I called her. She's there because I used her, and she helped me, and now she's in a room with her hands tied because I needed a laptop and a person I trusted. Her voice did not break. She would not let it break right now. I am not leaving her there. I'm not asking you to. I'm saying you are not going to that meeting alone. The text says alone. The text, Damien said, was written by people who have underestimated every element of this situation since the night you walked out of the estate. He picked up his phone again. They think you're a wife who found a folder. They don't understand what you've built in the last 48 hours. They don't know you've mapped the financial network, identified 4 people inside my organization, and distributed the evidence to multiple locations they cannot access. He looked at her. They think you're running scared. Let them think that. She looked at the photograph of Nora's furious, intact face. 20 minutes, Damien said. Give me 20 minutes. She looked at the text one more time. The meeting location wasn't specified. The address would come when she responded, which was standard, which meant they were controlling the terrain. She thought about her father, careful and methodical, who had been controlled on his terrain and had not survived it. She thought about what she was holding, the complete evidence, the financial map, the 4 names, the audio recording. The photograph of Marcus at the table with Calloway, dated 9 years ago, her father's handwriting on the back. She thought about the word architect, and she thought about the thing her father had written on the drive, the instruction that had been waiting 9 years for her to be ready for it. Deliver, if I cannot. He had not said destroy. He had not said hide. He had said deliver. Picked up the phone. She typed a single word response to the unknown number. Where? The reply came in 40 seconds. An address in the warehouse district, south of the river. 2 hours. She set the phone down. Damien was watching her. I need to tell you something, she said. About the meeting. About what I'm going to do when we get there. She held his gaze. And I need you to understand that what happens in that room cannot end the way your world usually ends things. Because if it ends that way, the evidence becomes a crime scene artifact, and the people above Calloway use it to bury everything that's left. Quiet. This ends in exposure, she said. Not in a warehouse. In the open. Every name, every account, every recorded conversation. Everything my father built, and everything I've added to it in the last 2 days. She held the drive up between them. This goes public. All of it. Or none of it means anything. Damien Cross looked at the drive in her hand. He looked at her face. She watched him understand what she was saying, not just about the evidence, but about what came after. About what exposing everything meant for his organization, for his name, for the 15-year empire that Marxas had been built inside. She watched him understand and not look away. Okay, he said. One word. Flat and certain and carrying more weight than any sentence he had said to her in 6 years. She put the drive back in her pocket. Outside, the city was beginning the slow process of becoming morning, the darkness thinning at its edges in the way it does before anyone decides to call it dawn. And Elena Voss sat in a chair in a safe house on the north side and understood something her father had known. and her husband was only now beginning to grasp that some things, once you see them clearly, cannot be unseen, and that the only way forward through them is straight ahead, without flinching, and without pretending the cost is smaller than it is. The address was a converted warehouse in the South District, blocks from the river, in the kind of neighborhood that had been scheduled for development twice in 15 years and remained exactly what it was: functional, unloved, the kind of place where the sound of something going wrong would be absorbed by concrete and distance before it reached anyone who might care. Elena knew the area. She had driven through it once with Damien, 2 years into the marriage, when he'd been assessing a property for an associate. She remembered the river smell and the particular quality of the silence there, at night not peaceful, just empty. They had an hour and 40 minutes. Damien spent the first 20 of those on the phone, standing in the corner of the apartment with his back to her, speaking in the low-clipped sentences that meant he was moving resources. She did not listen closely. She was doing her own work, the laptop open, the drive plugged in, the financial map she'd built, with Nora's help expanded now, with the account data Damien's financial contact had sent through in a compressed file at 5 in the morning. She worked with the focused mechanical calm of someone who has passed through the anxiety and come out the other side into a clarity that is almost frightening in its precision. The Halcyon accounts had not disappeared after her father's death. They had restructured exactly as Marcus and Calloway had discussed on the recording into a series of smaller entities that fed into 2 larger holding structures, both of which connected to legitimate businesses that Damien's organization touched without controlling. The money had been moving for 9 years through the seams of Damien's empire, invisible because it was adjacent to real operations, using real infrastructure, generating real transaction records that anyone auditing from the outside would read as ordinary. She found the thread at 6:47 in the morning. A single account, one of the 12 she'd been mapping, that had a receiving address she recognized. Not a company, a personal account, held under a name she had seen twice in the past 48 hours, once in her father's file and once on the organizational chart Damien had drawn from memory at the kitchen table an hour ago. The account belonged to a man named Gerald Foss, who was listed in Damien's organizational chart as the chief compliance officer for the legitimate side of his business operations. A man who had been in that role for 11 years. A man Elena had met 3 times at company events and retained only the vague impression of medium height, careful voice, the sort of professional presence that was designed to be forgettable. Gerald Foss was receiving money from the restructured Halcyon network. Regular transfers, modest amounts, consistent over 9 years. Not large enough to flag. Large enough to represent across that period a substantial cumulative sum. She cross-referenced him against her father's list of 8. Role number 6. Internal compliance maintains regulatory blind spots. Not Marcus. Not Calloway. A third name. A third person inside the structure. One she had not been looking for because she had been focused on the one she already had. Called Damien over. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Gerald, he said, he's been managing the regulatory side, making sure the account activity that should have triggered internal review never reached you. She kept her voice level. He's been in that role for 11 years, Damien. He was in place before Marcus brought me into the house. He's been there the entire time. Damien's breathing changed. Just slightly a fraction of an increase in rate. The kind that only happened when something hit the specific nerve that his management usually kept insulated. He attended your wedding, Damien said. She had not known that. She had not known Gerald Foss at the time of the wedding. He'd been a face she was introduced to later. But she understood what Damien was doing, the thing people do when they find out the frame of the painting is rotten, going back through every time they stood in front of it and recalibrating what they saw. We have to go, she said. He nodded. His face had returned to the operational place, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, a rawness that he was containing, not eliminating, just holding where it couldn't compromise what needed to happen in the next 2 hours. She unplugged the drive. She closed the laptop. She put on her jacket, felt the drive in the left pocket and the second copy of the full digital evidence package in the right, sent at 5:30 that morning to 3 separate encrypted email addresses belonging to individuals she had chosen carefully. a financial journalist who had been trying to investigate Halcyon's dissolution for 6 years without enough material to publish, a federal regulatory body contact, whose information her father had included in the original files with the notation trustworthy, and a lawyer she had consulted once about her father's estate who specialized in financial crime and had no connection to Damien's world. The evidence was already moving. Even if she walked into that warehouse and nothing came out, the evidence was already in motion. She had done what her father asked. The rest was what she chose. Damien's people arrived at 6:55, 4 of them, in 2 vehicles, people she recognized from the security detail she'd spent 6 years seeing in her peripheral vision. They did not look at her with curiosity or with the particular guarded deference she'd always received as the wife. They looked at her the way they looked at each other, which was the greatest practical adjustment the night had produced. Damien spoke to them briefly. She caught the structure of it. 2 vehicles, 2 approach vectors, she and Damien in the second car, the warehouse to be assessed before they were anywhere near it. No action inside until he signaled. The signal would be verbal, a specific word she didn't catch. Caught the last part. The priority is the woman being held inside. Everything else is secondary. She looked at him when he said it. He did not look back at her. He was already moving toward the car. The drive to the warehouse took 19 minutes. Elena sat in the back seat and did not speak. The man driving, she knew him as Terrence, had seen him at the estate gate 1,000 times, kept his eyes on the road and his hands loose on the wheel, and his shoulders in the specific set of someone who has done this before and long since. Stopped being afraid of it and was now simply focused. She envied that briefly. Her own hands in her lap were not shaking. She had expected them to be shaking. They were not. They were just her hands, resting on her knees, the same hands that had turned the pages of her father's notebooks 2 nights ago in a storage unit while the rain came down. The same hands that had unpicked the stitching from the notebook cover and found a USB drive that had been waiting 9 years to be found. She thought about what she was going to say to Marcus Vale. She had been thinking about it since the apartment. The pragmatics were clear what she needed from the meeting, what outcome she was working toward, the specific moment at which the prepared materials would be released to the 3 recipients who were already waiting. None of that was the thing she was thinking about. She was thinking about walking into a room with the man who had sat at her dinner table and called her Mrs. Cross with his slight formal courtesy, while knowing with total clarity that he had arranged the death of her father. She was thinking about whether she would be able to speak to him without what she felt being audible in every syllable. She thought she could. She thought the past 48 hours had installed something in her that was not coldness, but was adjacent to it, a capacity for functional detachment in the presence of information that would have broken her a week ago. She thought about her father, who had managed it long enough to build the case. He had been afraid. She could see that in the notebooks, but he had been functional inside the fear. She would be functional inside what she felt. The warehouse appeared at the end of a dead-end approach road, a long, low concrete building with loading bay doors along one side and a personnel entrance at the near end. Lights on inside, visible through the grimy clerestory windows near the roofline. 2 vehicles in the exterior lot, one she didn't recognize, one that was a model Damien's security team used for events, which meant it belonged to someone who had taken it from the organization. Her stomach tightened, and she breathed through it. Damien's hand came to rest briefly on the back of the seat, not touching her. Just proximate, a gesture she read as the closest he could get, in a car with 2 other people, to the thing he was not able to say. She did not move away from it. Terrence stopped the car 50 meters from the building entrance. The first vehicle had already peeled off to the secondary approach. Damien got out. Elena got out. The cold hit her pre-dawn cold, damp with the river proximity, the kind that gets into the joints. Damien looked at her once, direct, not asking anything, just looking. The way you look at someone when you understand the next few minutes may require a different kind of accounting than anything that's come before. She nodded. They walked to the personnel entrance. The door was unlocked. Open, in fact, left ajar by about 4 inches, which was either careless or an invitation, and the distinction mattered less than the fact of it. Damien pushed it the rest of the way and went through first. Elena followed. The interior of the warehouse was large and mostly dark, the light coming from portable work lamps set up in the center of the space, 3 of them. creating a lit area maybe 30 feet in diameter, surrounded by the darkness of the unlit building. Concrete floor was bare. The ceiling was high and lost in shadow. The smell was dust and rust and the particular staleness of a space that had been closed for a long time and recently reopened. In the lit area, Nora Hale, sitting in a metal chair, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, expression upon seeing Elena cycling through relief and fury in approximately equal measure. Beside her, standing with the unhurried posture of someone who has arranged this scene and found it satisfactory, was a man Elena did not recognize early 50s, a quality suit that was wrong for the location, kind of physical stillness that is trained rather than natural. Behind him, slightly to the left, Marcus Vale. He looked the same. That was the first thing she thought, which was irrational but persistent. She had expected him to look different. The way people look different after you understand who they are. But he looked exactly like he always had. The same moderate height, the same dark jacket, the same slight formal courtesy, even now in the set of his shoulders. He was looking at Damien. Elena looked at the man she didn't recognize. "You're Calloway," she said. "Renard Calloway." He confirmed it without inflection. "Mrs. Cross. Or perhaps Ms. Voss, given recent events. Please come in." She did not move farther into the lit area. Neither did Damien. They stood at the edge of it, and she felt without looking that Terence had not come through the door, but was somewhere in the darkness behind them, in the building, the way Damien's people had been instructed. "You wanted a meeting," Damien said. His voice was flat, colder than she'd heard it in years. "I wanted to conclude something that should have been concluded some time ago." Calloway glanced at Nora. "Your friend is unharmed. She'll stay that way as long as this conversation remains productive." "Release her now," Elena said, "when we're finished." "Release her now," she repeated, same volume, same pace. "She has nothing to do with the transaction you're here for. Keeping her doesn't improve your position. It's a demonstration, and we've both seen the demonstration. You can release her." Calloway studied her for a moment. She held his gaze and did not fill the silence. He said something to the man beside him who she hadn't clocked fully. She clocked him now, younger, operational. The person who had actually managed the logistics of taking Nora. He moved to Nora's chair and cut the zip ties with a folding knife. Nora stood up. She moved her wrists, looked at Elena, and did the specific thing Elena had been counting on her to do without being asked. She walked toward the edge of the lit area, toward the door, without running, without looking back. Elena heard the door behind her and breathed. One thing resolved. Everything else still open. "The drive," Calloway said. "No," Elena said. A pause. The word had landed in the silence of the warehouse with a clarity that surprised even her, not defiance for its own sake, just a simple declarative that meant what it said. Calloway's expression did not change much. She had the impression of a man who had run many of these conversations and was calibrating which version of them this one was. "You understand your position," he said. "I understand mine," she said. "I'm not sure you understand yours." She reached into her jacket pocket not for the drive, for her phone, and she held it up and turned the screen toward him. At 5:30 this morning, the complete contents of Thomas Voss's documentation, everything on the drive, plus the financial mapping I've done over the past 2 days that extends and updates his original work, was transmitted to 3 separate recipients: a journalist, a regulatory contact, an attorney specializing in financial crime. She kept the phone level. "They have instructions. If they do not receive confirmation from me by 8 a, that I am safe and uncompromised, the material is released in its entirety." Currently 6:58. The warehouse was very quiet. Marcus Vale moved for the first time. A small movement, he straightened slightly, the contained equivalent of a flinch. Calloway said, "You're bluffing." "I'm not." She lowered the phone. "I've been inside Damien's world for 6 years. I understand how people in his world think when they're holding leverage. Protect it. They keep it close, they do not release it, because releasing it means losing control of it." She looked at Calloway steadily. "I'm not from his world. I'm from my father's world, and my father's instinct when he understood he was in danger was to make sure the information survived him, regardless of whether he did. I inherited that instinct. The drive in my pocket is a courtesy. The evidence is already gone." Silence. Then Marcus said, from his position at Calloway's left, "She's telling the truth." Calloway turned to look at him. "She's her father's daughter. Marcus's voice was the same, that slight formal quality, the courtesy that she now understood as the costume it had always been. He was looking at Elena, not Calloway. Thomas Voss did exactly the same thing. He distributed before he came to the meeting. He paused. He just didn't have anyone who knew the people he'd distributed to. The implication of the last sentence settled over the warehouse like a drop in temperature. He meant that they had found and eliminated the copies after her father died. He was telling her that the strategy had failed before. He was telling her, with the calm specificity of a man who had done this and considered it resolved, that the question was whether her distribution had been thorough enough. She felt something move through her, cold and clean and absolute. Not fear. Something that had been processed past fear into a compound she didn't have a comfortable name for. "There's a difference," she said. "My father didn't have the complete financial map. His documentation named the structure and some of the people. It was incomplete. You found that out when you went through his files after he died and discovered that the final piece was missing." She held up the drive. "This has the complete documentation and the current financial map. The names on it are not historical. They are current. They are active. And the regulatory contact my father identified in his files, the one he marked as trustworthy, has been waiting 6 years for exactly this material." She could see Calloway processing. She pressed it. "You can take the drive. It's a copy of what was sent. It will tell you who has the information, but it won't help you stop it, because what I sent was encrypted, and the keys are not on the drive. Cannot decrypt it without my confirmation code, which I have not shared with anyone in this room." She was lying about the encryption. There was no encryption. The files had been sent as they were, but the lie was plausible, and she delivered it without a seam. Calloway looked at her. He looked at Damien. He looked back at her. Then what he said, "Do you want? I want Marcus Vale in handcuffs before I leave this building." She said it simply. "And I want you to understand that the choice in front of you is not between the evidence going public and being suppressed. The choice is between what happens to you if you cooperate and what happens if you don't. The evidence is released either way." Marcus made a sound. Not a word, a short exhale that contained, she thought, a quality she had not expected from him. Something almost like recognition. Calloway said, "You have no authority to—" "She doesn't need authority." Damien stepped forward, and the movement changed the geometry of the lit space. He was closer to Calloway now, his voice lower. Particular register, it reached when the management was entirely gone, and what was left was just the man, stripped back to the bedrock. "This conversation is being recorded. Has been since we walked through that door. My people have the exterior of this building and the secondary entrance and your vehicles." He looked at Marcus. 12 years, Marcus. Marcus met his eyes. The two men looked at each other, and Elena watched it, the specific charged silence of a relationship that had been real on one side and performance on the other for longer than she'd known either of them, arriving at the only moment it could honestly end. "I did what I was built to do," Marcus said. "You were built by me," Damien said. "No." Marcus's voice was even. "I was built by the people who funded your organization before you were old enough to run it. You inherited infrastructure that was already serving two purposes. I was part of the infrastructure." He said it without apology and without drama, the statement of a man who has lived inside a logic so long it has become simply fact. "You were never meant to know." The silence that followed was the longest one of the night. Then Damien said, "Kneel down." And something in his voice, the absolute, stripped-bare certainty of it, produced the thing that years of authority and 6 feet of physical presence and 15 years of reputation had not quite managed to produce in Marcus Vale, which was a response that did not calculate first. Marcus knelt. Elena watched it and felt nothing she could easily name, not satisfaction, not relief, some compound of both that was also neither, the way complex emotions tend to resist the simple containers people try to put them in. She turned to Calloway. "Your phone," she said. "Call your people off. Any surveillance on the journalist, the attorney, the regulatory contact, call it off. Now in front of me." Calloway looked at her for a long moment. She waited. The wait was easy, she discovered. She had learned something in the past 2 hours about the particular patience of a person who has already accepted the full cost of the position they're in. He reached into his jacket and took out his phone. That was when the lights went out. All 3 work lamps, simultaneously, plunged into total darkness, the kind that is absolute for the first 2 seconds before the eyes begin adjusting and things emerge in gray gradations from the dark. Elena dropped immediately, not a decision, reflex, her body making the choice that her mind caught up to a half-second later, down to the concrete floor, the coldness of it sharp against her palms. She heard movement to her left fast, purposeful, and understood that someone had planned for the lights, which meant the lamps had been rigged, which meant there was a person in this building who was not Damien's and was not Calloway's. She heard Damien's voice, somewhere in the dark, short, operational, the specific word she hadn't caught earlier, and caught now, cover. Sounds of movement. Sounds of the kind of physical struggle that is not dramatic but is brutal impacts, breath forced out, boots on concrete. She stayed low and moved toward where she had last seen the personnel door, not running, controlled, using the gray dark and the sounds to navigate. A gunshot. The sound of it in the concrete space was enormous and wrong, nothing like screens, an actual physical pressure in the ears and chest. She did not know where it came from or where it went. She found the wall with her hands. She followed it. A second shot. Closer. She pressed herself to the wall and stopped moving, and controlled her breathing in through the nose, count 2, out through the mouth, the way the self-defense instructor had taught her for a different kind of danger. But the physiology was the same, and she listened. Damien's voice, somewhere to her right, clipped and short, "I need a light." A phone light came on Terrence, 15 feet away, the beam sweeping the floor. In the light, she saw 2 figures on the ground, wrestling for something, saw Calloway on his feet moving toward the secondary entrance, saw Marcus Vale no longer where he had been. Scanned. Marcus was 8 feet from her. In the shadow, the wall light didn't reach. And he was looking directly at her with an expression she could not fully read in the dark, but which contained something that her body registered before her mind did not: aggression, not the cold operational look she'd expected. Something that was, in the inadequate dark of a warehouse at dawn, almost like the expression of a man who had done a calculation and reached a conclusion he did not entirely endorse but was committed to. He said quietly, "The drive." "No," she said, same word. Same tone. "The people above Calloway don't know about the distribution. They think this meeting was going to recover the original." He took a step toward her. "Give me the drive and I walk out of here, and they believe the evidence was recovered. Buys you time. You're still trying to manage the outcome," she said. "I'm trying to give you an exit. I don't need your exit." She held his gaze in the dark. "I needed you to have not killed my father. That was the exit I needed. You didn't give it to me." Something moved across his face. She saw it in the edge of the phone light, not regret exactly, but something in the family of it, something that acknowledged the specific accuracy of what she'd said in a way that was worse than denial would have been. He moved toward her, and Elena Voss did not run. She stood with her back to the warehouse wall and her hand in her jacket pocket, and she looked at the man who had ended her father's life and shaped her marriage and put her inside a house for 6 years while searching for something she'd been, carrying without knowing it, and she felt absolutely no impulse to retreat. "I will scream your name," she said. "In this building, with Damien's people, with Damien I will scream your name, and you will not make it to the door." Stopped. "Give yourself up," she said. "It's the only version of this where the story you tell about yourself has any shape at all." He stood in the dark and looked at her, and she could see him running the calculation, the last one, the one a person runs, when the options have genuinely narrowed to something real. She watched the calculation reach its end, and watched his shoulders change, a fraction, the drop of someone who has been holding a posture for so long that releasing it is its own kind of exhaustion. He put his hands up, not toward her, out to his sides. Standard gesture, the unambiguous one. She turned her head and said, not loudly, just clearly into the concrete dark, "Damien." The phone light swung toward them. Terrence's voice. Movement. The sounds of the situation resolving in the pragmatic way that situations resolve when one person makes the choice that closes the last door. Stood against the wall and breathed. Her hands, she noticed, were still not shaking. Outside, through the warehouse's high clerestory windows, the gray edges of the sky were beginning to differentiate themselves from the dark, not light yet, but the first indication that light was the direction things were moving. The gradual shift from one state to another that happens so slowly you cannot identify the moment it becomes something different from what it was. inside, voices, movement. The sounds of a situation that had not ended cleanly but had ended. Elena reached into her pocket and took out her phone. 6:59. 1 minute to spare. She sent the confirmation message to 3 email addresses, a single word: safe. Then she put the phone back in her pocket and stood against the wall and waited for whatever came next, which she did not yet know the shape of, but which she was no longer afraid to find out. The warehouse took a long time to become ordinary again. That was the thing nobody talked about: the aftermath, the specific quality of a space where something violent and irreversible had just happened, and how it did not immediately resume being just a building. It stayed charged for a while, the air different, the proportions somehow wrong, as though the concrete and steel had absorbed something they were still processing. Elena stood against the wall and watched Damien's people work. It was efficient and methodical, and entirely outside her vocabulary. The way they moved through the space, cleared it, communicated in the short verbal shorthand of people who had done this before. Terence had the presence of mind to get the work lamps back on within 4 minutes, which restored the visual logic of the space, even if the atmospheric one took longer. Marcus Vale sat on the floor with his hands zip-tied in front of him and his back against a support column, and he did not speak. He looked at the floor. His face had settled into an expression she could not fully characterize, not defeat, not the blankness of someone who had shut down, but something more considered than either of those. The expression of a man processing a set of facts that had until recently been arranged differently in his mind. Renard Calloway had not made it to the secondary exit. He had been stopped by 2 of Damien's people in the dark during the confusion of the lights going out, and he sat 12 feet from Marcus, also on the floor, also zip-tied. And he was looking at nothing in particular with the particular stillness of someone who had already begun the calculus of what came next and found it complex. The third operative, the one who had managed the lights, who was not from Damien's organization, and not from Calloway's structure, but from a third layer that she had only partially mapped in her Fazaufhaus, was unconscious near the secondary entrance, courtesy of a collision with Terence that had been decisive. She looked at him. Medium build, nothing distinctive. Kind of person who was designed to be instrumental and invisible, which told her something about the organization above Calloway that she filed away. She had sent the confirmation at 6:59. It was now 7:23. The journalist had already replied, received, standing by. Is this going to hold? She had not answered yet. Damien crossed the warehouse floor toward her. He had a cut on the side of his jaw, the skin split cleanly, bleeding without drama, the kind of injury that happens in the dark, when something connects that wasn't entirely aimed. He was pressing the heel of his hand against it, without much apparent concern, the way men of his history treated minor physical damage. Noted, managed, moved past, stopped in front of her. They looked at each other in the restored light of the work lamps, in the warehouse that smelled of dust and what had just happened, and the distance between them was the same physical distance. It had been 6 years of marriage, which was close, but it was loaded differently now with everything that had been said and done and revealed in the past 3 days. You're all right, he said. Not a question, an assessment. Yes. She looked at the cut on his jaw. You're bleeding. I know. He did not move to do anything about it. She reached into her jacket pocket, found a folded receipt from the pharmacy where she'd bought the second phone, and held it out. He looked at it for a moment, then took it and pressed it against the cut, with a slight wince that he contained immediately. She gave him credit for the wince. It was involuntary, and he didn't try to retroactively erase it, which was more honest than she'd come to expect from men who spent their lives managing the impression of their own invulnerability. The light, she said. Not mine. Not Calloway's either, from what I can tell. He glanced toward the unconscious man by the secondary exit. Someone above Calloway sent an observer, whether they were instructed to intervene or just paused. I don't know yet. They were supposed to recover the drive if the meeting failed. She had worked it out in the past 20 minutes, the scenario that made the timing make sense. Calloway couldn't get it through negotiation. The lights were the signal to take it by force. They didn't understand I didn't have the exclusive copy. And now they know. And now they know. She looked at her phone. 7:26. The journalist replied. She wants to know if the material is going to hold. What does that mean? It means is the chain of evidence intact? Is there enough corroboration in the documentation for publication without me providing active testimony? She put the phone in her pocket. There is. My father was thorough. But the journalist will push for more if she can get it. What kind of more? A statement on record. About the full context, she looked at him steadily, including the parts that involve your organization. Damien was quiet. She continued. The financial documentation traces money through entities that touch your infrastructure. That's in the material. The journalist will see it. She'll report it. She did not soften it. This was always going to include you. Told you that at the apartment. I know. He said it evenly. I said, okay. I want to make sure you understand what okay means in this context. It means public. It means regulatory investigation. It means the business structure that has operated under your name for 15 years will be examined in detail. She held his gaze. It means your name attached to things you didn't build, but benefited from. He was quiet for a longer moment. She watched his face and did not look away. I understand, he said. Gerald Foss needs to be reported, she said. Along with Marcus and Calloway, Gerald is already. He paused. My people contacted him 40 minutes ago. He is being held at a location until authorities can be involved. She absorbed this. You moved on him without me. You were in a warehouse in the dark. I made a call. He looked at her. It was the right call. She thought about it. She thought about whether she wanted to contest it. She decided she did not the outcome was right regardless of the process, and she was tired in a way that had begun somewhere around 4 a.m. and was now in her bones. Calloway, she said. He'll cooperate. He's the type. Damien glanced at the man on the floor. He built leverage, not loyalty. He has no one who will protect him, and enough people who would benefit from a deal. He'll talk, and the people above him. That's going to take time. The journalist's material starts it. The regulatory contact your father identified, that contact is going to be the one who converts the documentation into actionable enforcement. He looked at her. Your father chose well. The word sat between them. She felt the weight of her father's name in Damien's mouth, the specific quality of hearing someone acknowledge a man whose death they had not prevented, and whose memory they had handled, in their way, as badly as the circumstances allowed and no better. She did not thank him for the acknowledgement. It was not the kind of thing that wanted thanks. She walked across to where Marcus Vale sat against the column. He looked up when she stopped in front of him. His hands in the zip tie rested in his lap, and he looked at her with that expression she still couldn't fully name the considered one, the one that was doing something more deliberate than the situation strictly required. She crouched down so she was level with him. She did not do it for his comfort. She did it because she wanted to see his face at the same height as hers when she said what she was going to say. My father's name, she said. He met her eyes. Thomas Voss. I want you to say it. Something shifted in his face. A small thing. She waited. Thomas Voss, Marcus said. He was 44 years old. He had a daughter and a wife, and he had been at Halcyon for 8 months when he found what he found. And he spent the following 8 months documenting it carefully because he believed in due process and because he was trying to protect his family. She kept her voice even. He did everything right. He was careful and methodical and thorough, and it didn't matter. Marcus held her gaze. I need you to understand that I'm not telling you this for an apology. I know you don't have one that covers the distance. She stood back up. I'm telling you because for 9 years his name has been a number in a file and a role in a structure, and I need him to be a person one more time before this part is over. She turned and walked away from him. She did not look back at his face. She heard, very quietly, behind her, him say something. She did not turn. She thought perhaps he said the name again. Thomas Voss. She was not certain, and she chose not to verify it, because some things are better left at the edge of hearing where they cannot be tested and found wanting. The next 4 hours were procedural in the way that the aftermath of a thing is always procedural, the gap between the story and the paperwork, which is where most of reality actually lives. Damien's people managed the logistics of the warehouse with the competence she had always abstractly understood them to have, and was now observing directly, which was different. Authorities arrived, not the city police first, which she had half expected, but a federal contact Damien had maintained for years, at the level of mutual non-interference. The kind of relationship that exists in the gray territory between law enforcement and the structures it cannot quite reach without cooperation from the inside. That contact arrived with 2 colleagues and received, from Elena directly, full chain of documentation and a verbal account of the past 3 days that she delivered without editing and without asking Damien first whether any of it needed to be softened. It did not need to be softened. The truth was the point. Marcus Vale and Renard Calloway were removed from the warehouse at 8:40 in the morning, in separate vehicles, which was the last she saw of either of them directly. The third operative, who had regained consciousness but offered nothing except a name that turned out to be false, was handled by Damien's people in a way she did not ask the specifics of, because some things were still outside the frame of what she needed to know. Gerald Foss, she learned at 9:15 from Damien's brief phone report, had chosen to cooperate immediately and thoroughly. He had provided, in the first hour of his detention, the names of 4 additional individuals inside the larger network, above Calloway names that were not in her father's documentation, because they had come into the structure after Thomas Voss died, the new generation of an arrangement that had simply replaced what it lost and kept running. The journalist received this additional material at 9:45. The regulatory contact received it simultaneously. Nora was at a hospital, not because she was injured, she was not. She had been held for less than 4 hours, and treated with the specific consideration of people who understood she was instrumental rather than a target. But because Elena had insisted, and Nora's particular form of resistance to being insisted at was to agree to the hospital on the condition that Elena came in person to collect her, which Elena did at 10:30, driving a car she'd borrowed from Terrence. Nora was sitting on a hospital bed in a curtained bay, still wearing the clothes from the library the morning before, with a paper cup of coffee in both hands and an expression that cycled through several versions of the same thing when Elena pulled the curtain aside. "I'm fine," Nora said. "I know. I was angrier than I was scared, which I think reflects well on me." "Does." Nora looked at her. "Is it over?" Elena thought about the honest answer, which was that over was a more complicated word than it appeared. The warehouse was over. Marcus Vale was over. The specific physical danger of the past 72 hours was, for now, over. The rest of it, the investigations, the publications, the long procedural unwinding of something that had been built over 15 years, was not over. That would take months, possibly longer. "The part that was going to hurt us is over," she said. Nora considered this. "That's a careful answer." "It's the true one." Nora drank her coffee. She set the cup down on the bedside tray, with the precision of someone who is doing small things carefully, because the large things are still too large to hold all at once. "Your father," she said. "Yes, he'll be this will matter. Publicly. What he documented, what it cost him." Elena sat down in the chair beside the bed. She felt the chair take her weight in a way she was suddenly very aware of the specific physical relief of a surface supporting you when you have been entirely upright for a very long time. "It'll matter," she said. They sat there for a while without speaking, which was one of the things she had always valued about Nora, the capacity to be present without filling the space, to understand that some things needed to exist in quiet before they could be talked about at all. The weeks that followed were the kind that do not lend themselves to narrative in the way the 3 days before them did. They were slow and administrative and emotionally expensive in the way that sustained procedural engagement always is meetings with attorneys, depositions conducted in nondescript conference rooms with recorders on the table, phone calls from the journalist who was thorough and precise and whose questions were always exactly the right ones, which Elena respected even when they were painful to answer. The story published 41 days after the warehouse. The journalist had held it for the full documentation to be legally verified, which was the right call, even though the waiting was its own kind of wait. When it published, it was in 2 parts, a detailed financial investigation and a companion narrative account, and it did what her father's documentation was built to do. It made the invisible visible, it put names on structures, and it produced, in the weeks that followed publication, a chain of regulatory and investigative actions that she tracked from a distance because her part of it was done. Thomas Voss's name appeared in both parts of the article. His role was documented accurately. The journalist described him as meticulous and courageous and correct in everything he had found, and noted that he had been killed because he was all 3 of those things. Elena read that sentence 3 times. She did not cry. She had done her crying in the motel room at 2 in the morning, 3 days before the warehouse, alone with her father's notebooks, and what she felt, reading the sentence now, was something quieter and different, a quality of restoration. Maybe, though that word wasn't quite right either. Something had been returned to his name that had been missing for 9 years. The specific dignity of being recognized accurately. She kept the USB drive. She put it back inside her father's notebook, back inside the reinforced cover, and she put the notebook in the same box where she'd found it, in the same storage unit under her maiden name. She did not hide it. She did not lock it in anything more secure. She left it where her father had put it, because there was something right about that the evidence that had survived 9 years in the cover of an ordinary notebook deserved to rest where it had waited, now that it had done its work. She also kept the photograph, the one from her father's notebook, Marcus Vale at a table, younger, recognizable to her father's handwriting on the back. Kept it not as evidence, not as leverage, but because it was her father's handwriting, and she was not ready to let go of that yet, and she had decided that she did not need a reason beyond that to keep something. Damien moved out of the Bellamy estate in the 5th week. She knew because Terence told her not at Damien's instruction, she didn't think, but because Terence had worked for her for 6 years too, in his way, and understood that the information was hers to have. The estate was sold through a holding company, which she did not follow the details of, because they were not hers to manage. The company had begun a formal restructuring that, under the regulatory pressure the article had generated, was moving towards something that would not look like it had looked before. She did not know what it would look like when it was finished. She thought Damien didn't yet know either. He called her once during those 5 weeks. Once, which was the exact right number, enough to say what needed to be said, not enough to claim a relationship that was no longer what it had been, and could not simply be resumed. He called on a Tuesday evening. She was in her apartment, a rental, not the estate, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood she'd chosen herself, with a desk near the window where she'd put her father's other notebooks, the earlier ones, the domestic ones about grocery lists and car maintenance that she was slowly reading, now that she had the time and the steadiness to do it. "How are you?" he said. "Tired," she said. "Okay." "The depositions?" "Finishing next week." "Good." He was quiet for a moment. She heard him in whatever space he was, in unfamiliar acoustics, somewhere smaller than the estate. "I have a meeting in the morning with the regulatory attorney. She says the asset disclosures will take another 2 months. That sounds right. It's more than I expected. He said it without self-pity, which she appreciated. The amount that was moved through the structure without my knowledge is, he paused. It's more than I expected. Does that change how you think about it? No. The word was immediate and flat. What Marcus and Calloway built inside my organization that belongs to them. Cost of dismantling it belongs to me because it was my organization. The arithmetic. He was quiet. It's just a larger number than I'd prepared for. You're going to be all right, she said. She surprised herself by meaning it, not as encouragement, not as consolation, but as an assessment. He was not the kind of man who was not all right. He was the kind of man who did what was in front of him, which was what was in front of him now. I know, he said. I think I know. Another pause. I've been thinking about what you said, he said. Apartment. That I held my silence like a kindness. Yes, I've been thinking about it for 5 weeks. I know. She leaned back in her chair. Outside the window, the neighborhood was doing what neighborhoods do at Tuesday evening ordinary, continuous, indifferent, to the conversations being had inside the buildings it contained. I don't have a revision, he said. I can't tell you I'd have done it differently, because I don't know that I would have. I made the choices I made for the reasons I made them, and I believe those reasons were real, even though the result was wrong. He said it carefully, the way he said things when he'd been working on the phrasing. But I understand now that a reason being real doesn't make a choice right. That's what I didn't understand before. She let the sentence sit in the air. That's something, she said. It's not enough. I didn't say it was enough. I said it's something. He was quiet. She looked at the notebooks on her desk. The early ones, before Halcyon, before any of it, her father writing about ordinary things in his particular leftward slanting hand, the documentation of a life, before it was required to become evidence. Damien, she said. Yeah, my father would have been 61 this year. She said it not to wound him, but because it was true, and because the conversation had the weight for it. He liked detective novels and bad weather and explaining things to people. He would have been terrible at retirement. Damien was quiet. Thought she heard him breathe. He sounds like someone I would have respected, he said finally. He would not have respected you, she said. Not what you were. But I think he might have respected what you're doing now. They let that be where it was. They ended the call without making any plans, without any stated intention about what the space between them was or would become. She did not think either of them knew. She thought that knowing was honest, and honesty was the thing they had established as the baseline condition of whatever they were now, so she let it stand. The months moved. She went through her father's notebooks completely. The domestic ones first, then the professional ones from before Halcyon, the record of a career that had been careful and ordinary and decent. She found, in a notebook from the year she was 14, a passage that she read 3 times before she put the notebook down and sat with it. Her father had written, "He asked today why I double-check my work when I already know it's right. I told her because knowing isn't the same as proving. She said that seemed like a lot of extra effort. I told her the extra effort is the part that matters. She didn't look convinced. She'll understand it eventually." He sat with that for a long time. She had in the end understood it. She had done what he trained her to do without knowing he was training her the double-checking, the documentation, the patience to let the connections emerge from what was actually there. She had done it the way he did it, and it had worked the way it worked for him, with the difference that she had not been alone at the moment it mattered. She thought about what it would mean to say that to him. She thought about the conversation they would have had, the specific quality of his response measured, quietly pleased, probably deflecting into a question about what she was going to do next, because that was how he moved through things. Not dwelling, always toward the next true thing that needed doing. She thought about this and let it be an incomplete grief, which is the only kind available, and went back to reading. The investigation ran for 7 more months, before the first formal charges were filed. Calloway cooperated in full, as Damien had predicted, and the cooperation extended upward, past the people her father had named, past Calloway's own tier, to 3 individuals, at the layer above, who had never appeared in any documentation, and who were, by the time the charging documents were public, no longer able to manage the invisibility they had maintained for 20 years. The journalist covered each development. The regulatory body that her father had trusted proved trustworthy. Gerald Foss received a sentence. The details of it she read in the article and did not revisit. Accountable. The accounting was proceeding. That was the shape of justice available, and she had spent enough of her life grieving the gap between available and sufficient to understand that the gap did not make the available meaningless. Marcus Vale's trial was scheduled for the following spring. She would be called to testify. She had known this since the 5th week, and had made her accommodation with it the way she made her accommodation with most difficult things, by looking at it steadily, without flinching, until it became something she could carry. On the last day of the year, she drove to the Bellamy estate. Not to go inside the property had changed hands, and the new owners had already begun visible alterations, but because she had driven away from those gates 6 months ago, with something unfinished behind her, and she had decided it was time to close it on her own terms. She parked outside the gate and sat in her car for a while, looking at the building that had been her home for 6 years. It looked smaller, which was the thing buildings always did when you saw them, without the relationships that had inflated them. Just a building. Good bones, high windows, the particular self-possession of structures built to project authority in an era that took that kind of projection seriously. She thought about the life she'd had inside it. Not with bitterness, she had processed the bitterness in stages over the past 6 months, and found at the bottom of it something more complicated. 6 years of a real life, imperfect and incomplete, and built on a foundation that had rot in it she hadn't known was there. Real meals and real conversations, and the genuine knowledge of another person that only comes from sustained proximity. She did not want to pretend that none of it had mattered. Pretending would be its own kind of dishonesty, and she was done with dishonesty in all its forms, including the self-protective kind. She was sitting there, not particularly thinking anymore, just looking, when a car pulled up alongside hers. She knew the car. She did not know if she'd expected this or not. She had not planned it, and she did not think he had planned it either. which made it either coincidence or the kind of thing that happens when two people have been moving through the same orbit long enough that their paths eventually intersect without arrangement. Damien got out. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, which was a small marker of the months, the accumulation of new things in the gap between the person he'd been and whoever came next. He looked at the estate, then he looked at her car. Then she opened her door and got out. They stood outside the gate of the Bellamy estate at the end of a year that had cost them both more than they'd had prepared for. And they looked at each other the way people look when the performance has been entirely stripped away, and what remains is just the fact of two people standing in the same space. He said, "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't either until this morning." He nodded. He looked at the building. "They've changed the east wing." "I can see that. It's better," he said. He did not sound wounded by it. It was always a bit much, that wing. She looked at him. In the flat winter light, he looked not diminished. That was the wrong word. And it would have been too easy anyway, older, maybe. More accurately, himself. The way people look when they have stopped maintaining the version of themselves designed for a particular context and have not yet entirely assembled the next version. She thought about the past 6 months, the depositions, the journalist's questions, the evening call on a Tuesday, the notebooks on her desk, the USB drive in the cover of a notebook in the storage unit under her maiden name. She thought about her father's instruction, "Deliver if I cannot." She had delivered. She had delivered in the form he'd built it for, to the people who could use it, through the channels that could act on it, at the cost it actually required, rather than the cost she'd hoped it might be. Thought about what came after delivering. Her father's notebooks didn't cover that part. That part was hers. Damien looked at her. He was not asking anything. That was correct. There was nothing to ask. No question that had a clean answer. No arrangement that could be simply proposed. He was just standing in front of her, which was the honest thing. Just being a person who had made serious errors and serious corrections and was standing on the other side of both, not yet knowing what the other side looked like when you lived in it for a while. "You finally gave it to me," she said. He looked at her. "The truth," she said. "You finally gave it to me." Quiet for a moment. She watched him receive the words, not relieved by them, not taking them as absolution, which was correct. Just receiving them for what they were. "I should have given it to you years ago," he said. "Yes." She did not soften it. "You should have." They stood with that. The year moved around them, the cold working its way into the collar of her jacket, the way cold does when you've been standing still too long. Guy, the particular flat white of winter, that has stopped threatening and started simply being what it is. Turned. She did not begin walking back to her car. She stood beside him, facing the building, both of them looking at the thing that had been and was now something else. Stayed. Not because she had forgotten. She had not forgotten. She did not believe in forgetting as a mechanism, found it too indistinguishable from self-deception to fully trust. She stayed because the man beside her had, in the final hour, chosen truth over every other thing he valued, and that choice had cost him everything he had built, and he had made it anyway. And she was her father's daughter, methodical and careful, and she had learned to give full weight to the evidence actually in front of her rather than only to the evidence that was easier to hold. The estate was gone. The secret was fully exposed. The enemies were finished, or in the long process of being finished, which was the most that could honestly be said. And the two people standing outside the gate had nothing left between them, except what was actually true, which was enough, finally, to stand on. The winter afternoon was brief and cold and moving steadily toward dark, the way winter afternoons do, without drama or announcement, simply becoming what they were always going to become. And she stood in it, and he stood in it, and neither of them spoke again for a long time, because there was nothing left to say that the standing there did not already say more honestly. That was how it ended, not with ease, not with anything restored to what it had been before, because nothing was, and pretending otherwise would have been the one dishonesty neither of them had any appetite left for. Just two people at a gate, at the end of a year, in the cold, with nothing left to hide.